Welcome to the Real News. I'm Jessel Noor. The US vaccine rollout is putting the profits of pharmaceutical companies over people, but it doesn't have to be this way. 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic, President Biden announced that by May, the US will have enough doses to vaccinate the entire adult US population.
Let me say that again. When we came into office, the prior administration had contracted for not nearly enough vaccine to cover adults in America. We rectified that. This country will have enough vaccine supply, I'll say it again, for every adult in America by the end of May.
The announcement marks a potential major milestone in fighting the coronavirus, which has killed over 500,000 Americans over the past year. And Biden said it was made possible because Johnson Johnson, the maker of a newly approved coronavirus vaccine, has agreed to share its technology with the rival company in order to speed up production.
Johnson Johnson and Merck will work together to expand the production of Johnson Johnson's vaccine. This is the type of collaboration between companies we saw in World War II. We also invoked the Defense Production Act to equip 2 Merck facilities to the standards necessary to safely manufacture the J&J vaccine.
The watchdog group Public Citizen praised the move, but in a letter urged Johnson Johnson to make their vaccine formula, which requires a single dose and doesn't need to be stored in extremely cold temperatures, available to other manufacturers across the globe. Critics have warned of vaccine apartheid. As wealthy countries hoard doses, over 130 poor countries are yet to receive a single dose, and vaccines might not be widely available worldwide until 2024. We recently spoke to Peter Maybarduk, Access to Medicine's director at the watchdog Public Citizen, about why he's calling on the Biden administration to use their authority to speed up vaccine production. So for months, Public Citizen and other allied groups have been warning of this developing vaccine apartheid. There was a recent headline about North Korea seeking to steal the vaccine formula from one of the manufacturers. But you and many others have argued the U.S. can step in and make manufacturers share the formula, the recipe for these vaccines with the world, especially since taxpayers have spent billions developing the vaccines and the technologies that made them possible. Can you explain?
Of course. Well, no corporation produces at scale for the entire world. And indeed, even if we meet the most optimistic projections of current supply, in low and middle income countries, we're not likely to hit more than a 20%, 1 in 5 people vaccinated by the end of this year. So we need to dramatically ramp up our efforts to vaccinate the world. And a part of that is sharing vaccine recipes with qualified manufacturers everywhere so that we're enlisting the maximum possible capacity and potentially shortening the pandemic. Our own estimate is that an investment of $25 billion would allow the United States government and others to add vaccine production lines here and around the world, potentially contributing 8 billion more doses to the global response within a year's time. Now, a year may not sound that fast, but if we consider the terrifying fact that the pandemic is presently projected to course for several years, particularly in developing countries, then getting to that sort of scale within a year looks pretty good. It means we could shorten the pandemic. It means that we might be able to save 1 million lives and $1 trillion. And so a part of that is spinning up the manufacturing, and a part of that is ensuring that we're enlisting maximum capacity all around the world, showing manufacturers how to make safe and effective vaccines, providing them the know-how for the best technology that's available today. And notably, this can be done with appropriate compensation to those that have provided some of the key research and development inputs. But as you note, one of those is the taxpayer. One of those are taxpayers not only in the United States, but around the world. It's public agencies that have helped develop some of the key vaccine platform technologies and accelerate the development of vaccines this year. So we paid for it in significant part, and now we need to put that technology to work to end the pandemic as quickly as possible.
To be clear, these vaccine manufacturers have already made billions. The stock owners have already made billions and billions of dollars. So we're not. The request really isn't for them to give up any right to profit off this. It's just, as you said, to make this available. I think this is because this really isn't talked about, in discourse or in the media very often. I just want to talk more. I just want to just address that point a little bit.
We think in the present context, the world can afford to compensate vaccine makers and those that have truly invested in meaningful research for their work. What we can't afford is corporate secrecy that fragments the available supply and limits our availability to roll out as many doses as possible. The entire world is a potential market for these vaccines. So it's not as though there's a question of whether the companies will be able to recoup investment. Furthermore, it's the public that has invested in many of these vaccines to a significant degree. Federal agencies, public agencies around the world have advanced coronavirus research into the family of coronavirus diseases, which includes SARS and MERS, long before the pandemic, past 15 to 20 years. It's also the public that invented, for example, the stabilized spike protein on which many of the vaccines rely for some of their early stage testing. And that's all before the pandemic itself. Over the course of the past year, of course, it's public agencies that have funded the development and the acceleration of these vaccines, shepherding the vaccines through clinical trials, paying for 100% of the development of the Moderna vaccine, for example. So the public is all paid up, and there's plenty of market there. And what we cannot afford any longer is to allow companies to just guard as corporate secrets in the hopes. See, the companies have hopes of future profitability from the same technologies. Companies like Moderna are hoping that mRNA is useful time and time again, and they will be able to sell future products using the same technology. And for that reason, they're hesitant to share it with the world now. But there's a moral imperative, and people are suffering. And if we want to get through this pandemic, we have to share out that technology so that the world can get to scale and provide vaccines for everyone who needs them. The public has already paid for it, and it's really the least that we can ask.
ProPublica recently reported the U.S. can't deliver vaccines faster than this summer because of a range of issues, including limits on technology and production capability. And they talked about the limits of just using the Defense Production Act, as many have called on President Biden to do. Top infectious disease expert Anthony Fauci said, "This is not like making shoes." What's your response to this?
Well, it does take. I agree with Dr. Fauci. Of course, it does take months, but it doesn't need to. But it doesn't need to take. But it can go faster than some people expect. And again, if we think of the timeline of the current pandemic, investing now and sharing recipes now in order to have billions more doses around the end of this year is incredibly worth doing. It could restart the global economy. It could save a great many lives all around the world. So it's necessary. And there are a number of tools that are available to governments and to companies to accelerate this manufacture. The uses of the Defense Production Act that we've seen so far are critical and also just kind of scratch the surface. We think the Defense Production Act can be used not only to prioritize certain contracts or help source the raw materials and inputs for vaccines, but also authorize the production of the vaccine itself by other producers. Also transfer the essential know-how, how to make a vaccine from one manufacturer to another. There are a number of authorities under existing law that President Biden can use without going to Congress to share vaccine recipes with the world and get to maximum scale. In addition to the Defense Production Act, you have the Bayh-Dole Act and 28 U.S.C. 1498 to authorize use of the patented inventions. There's also the All Hazards Pandemic Preparedness Act to facilitate public production of vaccines and other medical countermeasures to the pandemic. So the president has significant authority to act under existing law, and it's really just a question of how ambitious we want to be and whether we see sort of the limit of the response being the U.S. response in these next few months, or whether we want to think about the global problem and the timeline that the rest of the world is on.
Is the bottom line that even under, and you kind of expect this under President Trump, but even under President Biden, a Democrat, the U.S. is putting the profits of these vaccine manufacturers over the lives of what could be hundreds of thousands of people?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. The Biden administration has helped put the country certainly on a better course and a more globally cooperative course than we were seeing under the prior administration. It is also the case that we still need to see greater ambition, both about dealing with the global pandemic and about telling companies what to do, understanding that ultimately vaccine manufacturers need to be available to serve the world during a crisis. I think one of the failures of the world through the pandemic so far has been just an unwillingness to conscript manufacturers according to public need, and instead we have handed extremely large grants in the hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars to corporations in hopes that their profit needs would align with the public need. So it is appropriate that the public made those investments because we needed to accelerate vaccine development. But I think that it is also appropriate to impose some tougher conditions on the investments that the public has made in the companies. Greater transparency, greater sharing of the technology, affordability parameters, other things just to make sure that the technologies we're investing in will be available to all of us as quickly as possible and for enduring uses in the future as well, to deal with the next pandemic, to deal with variants of the coronavirus which threaten us today. To use a really concrete example, why is it the case that the Pfizer vaccine needs to be stored at 80 below, while the extremely similar so-called Moderna vaccine, which is really the people's vaccine, the National Institutes of Health taxpayer-funded vaccine, has much simpler storage requirements, can be stored at a higher temperature, does not require the same extreme cold chain. And the reason is that Pfizer hasn't shared its technology with Moderna, and so the world is not simply benefiting from the best technology for each vaccine. Instead, we're allowing companies to protect their trade secrets, their corporate secrets, in order to maximize revenue at the expense of the best possible public health response.
So even as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to take a horrific death toll, there are examples the world can look to. For example, the fights against polio and even AIDS. And polio was considered something like the coronavirus in the 1950s, and AIDS, continued to take a massive worldwide toll into like the 90s and even beyond. Talk about so you've raised a number of important issues in this interview. Talk about the lessons that are being drawn from history right now, and the successes and the mistakes of past global responses to pandemics.
We all learned quite a bit from HIV/AIDS. Millions of people died needlessly during that time 20 years ago because they could not afford drugs that were priced at more than $10,000 per person per year. Those drugs have been catalyzed by taxpayer investments, public dollars, and it was revealed could be manufactured for less than $1 per day. And it was that realization and social protest and movements giving birth to the work that I do today that showed that demonstrated sort of the moral imperative and showed that indeed we could treat the world. So in the time since, millions of lives have been saved through the sharing of HIV/AIDS medicine technology and the advent of generic competition, pushing prices down to the point where global public health agencies thought it was now cost effective to save the lives of poor people around the world. About 20 million lives have been saved so far through the sharing of HIV/AIDS medicine technology and the advent of generic competition. So there's a significant lesson there, because early in the HIV/AIDS pandemic, the line was, you can't do it, it's too complicated, other companies can't manufacture these drugs, and that was proved to be wrong. We learned the benefits of scale, we learned the benefits of sharing, we learned the benefits of generic competition. And while the coronavirus pandemic and the vaccine technologies are a step more complicated still, we still think it's a considerable mistake to think that the best course is just to allow for corporate control of the technology. Instead, that technology should be shared out so that as many manufacturers as possible can work with it, improve on it, lower the costs, and importantly now increase the volume. So those are lessons from HIV/AIDS. And in the case of polio, we had a vaccine, the inventor of which refused to patent it, and that sort of helped contribute to the rollout of of a massively ambitious worldwide campaign that eventually eradicated the disease. I'll use one more example from even more recent history. The US government during the Bush administration launched a campaign to expand the world's flu vaccine manufacturing capacity. It was rather below the headlines, but a partnership between the US government and the World Health Organization and a dozen or so countries around the world expanded those countries' flu vaccine manufacturing capabilities from about 1 million doses to 500 million doses. And if we do the same today on a more ambitious scale that reflects the scale of this crisis, it's clear to us that once again we could save a great many lives and shorten the pandemic. So we have to learn from the past and be ambitious about the present.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us and providing this perspective, which is often excluded in the media, in the news, and challenging the ways we think about this coronavirus response.
Thanks so much for having me.
And before you go, a reminder that viewer support is absolutely crucial to The Real News. If you can, please go to therealnews.com/support and become a monthly sustainer for as little as $5 a month. I'm Jess Lenore for The Real News Network.